in the hushed corridors of justice and power, where secrets long buried begin to stir under the weight of public scrutiny, we turn our attention to one of the most staggering revelations in contemporary history, the Epstein Files. These are not mere papers or scattered records. They represent an unprecedented archive of truth, a vast repository that has only recently been thrust into the light through deliberate acts of transparency. At the heart of this moment stands the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a landmark piece of legislation that compelled the full disclosure of materials long shielded from view. Signed into law on the 19th of November, 2025, this act mandated the systematic release of every document, every recording, and every image connected to the investigations, court proceedings, and operational details surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and his extensive network. By the 30th of January 2026, the floodgates had opened wide, with the Department of Justice unleashing over 3.5 million pages of documents, more than 2,000 videos, and approximately 180,000 images, alongside subsequent batches that continue to emerge even now. This is no ordinary data dump. It is a seismic shift in how we confront the intersections of wealth, influence, and accountability in our society. Consider the sheer scale of what has been revealed. These files encompass decades of meticulously compiled records, ranging from internal memos and investigative reports to personal correspondences, financial ledgers, and photographic evidence that paint a detailed portrait of activities that spanned continents and social strata. The documents include unredacted flight manifests from private aircraft, detailed logs of properties that served as hubs for gatherings, and thousands upon thousands of emails exchanged among key figures in Epstein's orbit. There are survivor statements transcribed with care, police reports from multiple jurisdictions that document patterns of behavior over years, and legal filings that trace the evolution of cases from initial complaints to federal indictments. Videos captured in various settings, some from security footage, others from personal recordings, offer visual context to events that were once whispered about in shadows. Images, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, include everything from property layouts to personal interactions, many of which had been classified or restricted prior to the act's enforcement. Together, they form a mosaic that demands careful examination, not for spectacle, but for the profound insights they provide into systems of power that operated with apparent impunity for far too long. Why do these files matter so profoundly in this era? In a world where information is often curated, filtered, or withheld, the Epstein Files stand as a testament to the power of enforced openness. They arrived at a time when public trust in institutions had been strained by repeated instances of leniency toward the elite, and their release was the direct result of sustained advocacy from victims' rights groups, journalists, and lawmakers who argued that secrecy only perpetuated harm. The Transparency Act itself was born from years of legal battles and congressional hearings, where evidence mounted that partial disclosures in earlier years had left critical gaps that allowed questions to linger unanswered. With the 30th of January 2026 release, those gaps began to fill. We see, for the first time in comprehensive form, how interconnected threads of influence wove through financial institutions, political circles, scientific communities, and international diplomacy. The files do not simply list names or events. They illuminate mechanisms, recruitment strategies, logistical operations, and protective alliances that enabled a web of exploitation to thrive undetected or unchallenged for extended periods. As we navigate these documents, it becomes clear that their value lies in the unvarnished details they preserve. Redactions remain in places, of course, protecting ongoing sensitivities or personal privacy where necessary, but the volume of newly available material is overwhelming. One can trace the chronology of Epstein's activities through time-stamped records, cross-reference addresses, and contacts across multiple continents, and observe how certain patterns repeated across properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and beyond. The videos provide moving context, capturing environments and interactions that words alone could not convey, while the images serve as visual anchors, grounding abstract descriptions in tangible reality. This archive is not static. It invites analysis, cross-verification, and reflection. Scholars, investigators, and everyday citizens alike now have access to raw source material that was previously accessible only to a select few within law enforcement or the courts. It democratizes knowledge in a way that few historical precedents can match, forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about how privilege can insulate wrongdoing. The significance extends far beyond the immediate case. These files challenge us to examine broader questions of justice in modern society. How does a system allow such extensive operations to persist? What role do non-disclosure agreements, plea deals, and institutional inertia play in shielding the powerful? The Epstein Files offer concrete examples detailed in emails, witness accounts, and operational logs that reveal not just individual actions, but systemic vulnerabilities. They underscore the importance of victim-centered narratives, where testimonies preserved in these pages highlight resilience amid profound adversity. Survivors' voices, captured in affidavits and depositions now fully public, remind us that behind every document is a human story of courage in coming forward, often against overwhelming odds. The releases also highlight the tireless work of media outlets that pushed for transparency through investigative reporting, as well as the contributions of legal teams who fought in civil suits to unseal records that might otherwise have remained buried indefinitely. Yet, even as we absorb the magnitude of this disclosure, we must approach it with measured deliberation. The files are dense, layered with legal terminology, chronological complexities, and occasional contradictions that arise from the chaotic nature of real-world investigations. Some sections corroborate long-standing allegations with new evidence, while others introduce nuances or previously unknown connections that reshape our understanding of timelines and relationships. Heavy redactions in certain areas, often for national security considerations or to safeguard unrelated third parties, prompt ongoing debate about what remains hidden and why. Critics have noted that while the act achieved an extraordinary level of openness, full clarity may still require additional context from future releases or complementary inquiries. This is the essence of the Epstein Files. They are not a closed book, but an opening chapter in a larger conversation about transparency, power, and reform. Delving deeper into the structure of these documents reveals their meticulous organization by the Department of Justice teams tasked with compliance. Batches were prepared with metadata intact where possible, allowing researchers to trace origins, revisions, and chains of custody. Flight logs, for instance, detail passenger manifests, departure times, and destinations with precision, offering a logistical blueprint of movements that span the globe. Address books and contact lists, digitized from physical records, contain thousands of entries that map social and professional networks in exhaustive detail. Communications archives include not only emails but also text messages and handwritten notes scanned for preservation, providing a window into decision-making processes that were once opaque. The visual elements, videos, and images have been indexed by date and location, facilitating chronological study without overwhelming the viewer. This level of detail transforms the files from mere evidence into a historical resource, one that historians will study for generations to understand the dynamics of influence in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The public reaction to the 30th of January 2026 dump was immediate and multifaceted. Media outlets across the spectrum devoted extensive coverage, analyzing subsets of the material in real time as it became available. Online repositories and archival platforms experienced surges in traffic as citizens sought to engage directly with the primary sources. Advocacy organizations used the files to bolster calls for legislative changes, such as stricter oversight of private aviation and enhanced protections for trafficking victims. At the same time, the releases sparked thoughtful discourse on the ethics of public consumption, how to balance the right to know with the need to respect the dignity of those affected. In this way, the Epstein Files have become more than documents. They are a catalyst for societal self-examination, prompting reflections on complicity, silence, and the responsibilities that come with knowledge. As we continue to unpack this extraordinary collection, layer by layer, it is essential to maintain a perspective rooted in facts rather than speculation. The files provide corroborated details that fill in blanks left by earlier, more limited disclosures. They reveal the breadth of Epstein's operations through property records, maintenance logs, and staff communications that describe daily functionalities. They document interactions across elite spheres via invitations, thank you notes, and shared itineraries that illustrate how access was cultivated and maintained. Financial trails, preserved in transaction summaries and investment overviews, hint at the economic underpinnings that sustained the network. All of this is presented not to sensationalize but to inform, to allow patterns to emerge organically from the evidence itself. The Epstein Files Transparency Act's legacy is already evident in the way it has reshaped expectations for government accountability. By setting a precedent for large-scale declassification in high-profile cases, it encourages similar efforts in other arenas where secrecy has long prevailed. Victims and their supporters have found validation in the comprehensive nature of the release, seeing their experiences reflected and preserved in official records. The documents serve as a safeguard against revisionism, ensuring that the historical record remains intact and accessible. In an age of digital ephemera and selective memory, this physical and digital archive stands as a bulwark, a reminder that truth, once compelled into the open, cannot easily be retracted. We stand at the threshold of this vast vault, where whispers from the past echo with newfound clarity. The Epstein Files invite us to listen closely, to study diligently, and to reflect deeply on the implications for justice, power, and human dignity. They are a call to vigilance, a repository of lessons hard-earned through years of investigation and advocacy. As more batches emerge and analyses deepen, their full impact will continue to unfold, reshaping narratives and informing policy for years to come. This is the beginning of a profound exploration, one grounded in the unyielding light of disclosure, where every page, every frame, and every detail contributes to a clearer understanding of events that touch the highest echelons of society. The files are here now, open for examination, demanding nothing less than our careful, unwavering attention to the truths they hold. In the vast expanse of the Epstein Files, where millions of pages chronicle decades of activity, connections, and operations, one thread emerges with particular intrigue: the origins of the man whose name now echoes through those documents. Jeffrey Edward Epstein entered the world on the 20th of January, 1953, in the borough of Brooklyn, New York, a place that, at the time, embodied the hard-working spirit of post-war America. His birthplace was not one of privilege or inherited wealth, but rather the modest, tightly knit community of Seagate, a gated enclave situated along the western shore of Coney Island. This neighborhood, with its rows of modest homes, proximity to the Atlantic Ocean, and sense of insular working-class resilience, provided the backdrop for his early years. Seagate, in the 1950s and 1960s, was a far cry from the glittering Manhattan skyscrapers that would later define his adult life. It was a community where families scraped by, where the rhythms of daily existence revolved around public service jobs, small businesses, and the seasonal bustle of the nearby amusement parks and boardwalks. Epstein's family lived in a rented apartment within this setting, a household that reflected the economic realities faced by many Jewish immigrant descendants in mid-century New York. His parents, Seymour George Epstein and Pauline Paula Stolofsky Epstein, had married in 1952, just months before his birth. Seymour, born in 1916, worked as a groundskeeper and gardener for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, tending to the city's green spaces with the quiet dedication of someone who understood manual labor and civic duty. Pauline, a homemaker and part-time school aide, managed the household with care, her own roots tracing back to Jewish immigrant families from Eastern Europe, Lithuanian on her side, Polish on her husband's. Together, they raised Jeffrey and his younger brother, Mark, in an environment that emphasized humility, hard work, and the value of education as a potential pathway out of modest circumstances. Neighbors from those years later recalled the Epstein family as quiet and unassuming, with Pauline described as a wonderful mother who kept the home running smoothly. Jeffrey himself was remembered by childhood acquaintances as sweet and generous, though somewhat nerdy, and reserved a boy who preferred intellectual pursuits over the rough and tumble street games common in the area. He showed an early aptitude for mathematics and even developed skill as a pianist, talents that hinted at a mind capable of precision and focus amid the ordinary surroundings of Coney Island's working-class streets. Epstein's academic promise became evident early on. He attended local public schools in Brooklyn, progressing through the system with notable speed. Remarkably bright, he skipped 2 full grades, demonstrating an exceptional grasp of subjects like math and science that set him apart from his peers. By the time he reached Lafayette High School in Gravesend, Brooklyn, an institution whose student body was predominantly Italian-American, he stood out not only for his intellect, but also, at times, for the subtle challenges of navigating a diverse environment where anti-Semitism occasionally surfaced. Yet he thrived academically, graduating in 1969 at the tender age of just 16. This early completion of high school was no small feat, in an era when many young people from similar backgrounds entered the workforce immediately after secondary education. Instead, Epstein pursued higher learning, enrolling that same year at the prestigious Cooper Union for the advancement of science and art in Manhattan. There, he delved into studies that aligned with his strengths in mathematics and physics, immersing himself in rigorous coursework that demanded analytical rigor. After 2 years, he transferred to the Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences at New York University, continuing his education for another 3 years. Despite this impressive trajectory through some of the city's finest institutions, Epstein did not ultimately earn a college degree. He left NYU without graduating, a detail that would later become central to the enigma surrounding his professional ascent. In the files and records that document his life, this period underscores a pattern. A young man of undeniable talent, forging a path through intellect and determination, yet without the conventional credentials that typically open doors in elite circles. Undeterred by the absence of a formal degree, Epstein entered the workforce in a role that placed him directly in the orbit of New York's most affluent families. In September 1974, at the age of 21, he began teaching calculus and mathematics, and later physics at the Dalton School, an exclusive private institution on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The Dalton School was, and remains, a bastion of privilege, where the children of billionaires, prominent politicians, media moguls, and cultural icons received their education. Its alumni list reads like a who's who of American elite. Figures such as Anderson Cooper, Chevy Chase, and Claire Danes walked its halls. How Epstein secured this position remains one of the earliest mysteries in his story. Without a college diploma or teaching certification, he nonetheless impressed the school's administration enough to be hired. Some accounts suggest he may have presented or implied academic credentials that were not fully verified at the time, a reflection of an era when personal charisma and demonstrated knowledge could sometimes outweigh paperwork. The headmaster during his hiring, Donald Barr, a former member of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, oversaw a faculty that valued intellectual sharpness. Epstein taught with a style that students later described as charismatic, yet unconventional. He pushed boundaries, occasionally disregarding strict dress codes by appearing in a fur coat, gold chains, and an open shirt. Reports from the period note that he was the only teacher to attend student parties where alcohol flowed freely, blurring lines between educator and social figure in ways that raised eyebrows among colleagues. His classroom presence was engaging, focused on complex concepts in math and physics that resonated with high-achieving students. Yet, evaluations eventually highlighted shortcomings in traditional teaching methods. Epstein's time at Dalton lasted only 2 years, from 1974 to 1976. Following the appointment of a new headmaster, his contract was not renewed, with an internal assessment citing deficiencies in his instructional approach. It was during this brief tenure, however, that a pivotal connection formed, one that would propel him into the rarefied world of high finance. In 1976, during a parent-teacher conference, Epstein impressed the father of one of his students with his sharp intellect and conversational prowess. That parent happened to be a figure with ties to Wall Street and made a referral to Alan Ace Greenberg, the influential CEO of Bear Stearns, one of the era's premier investment banks. Greenberg, known for his preference in hiring ambitious individuals from modest backgrounds who possessed a deep desire to become rich, saw potential in Epstein. Despite the lack of a degree and any formal training in finance, Epstein was granted an interview. He reportedly excelled in discussions around quantitative analysis, options trading, and market strategies, demonstrating an innate understanding of complex financial instruments. Bear Stearns hired him shortly after his departure from Dalton, placing him in a role focused on developing and marketing quantitative analysis for options. a cutting-edge area at the time that required mathematical acumen rather than traditional banking pedigrees. What followed was a remarkably swift rise within the firm. Starting as a junior employee in 1976, Epstein advanced with unusual speed through the ranks at Bear Stearns. By 1980, he had become a limited partner, a position that granted him significant status and compensation in an environment where such promotions typically required years of proven performance and established networks. His work involved sophisticated financial modeling, asset management, and client advisory services, leveraging the same analytical skills that had defined his academic and teaching phases. Colleagues from those years described him as driven, with an ability to cultivate relationships that opened doors. Yet, even in these early professional records, hints of opacity emerge. Epstein's financial activities during this period involved elements that were not entirely transparent. Early forays into consulting and investment strategies that blurred lines between personal gain and institutional roles. He departed Bear Stearns in 1981, after approximately 5 years, to establish his own ventures. This transition marked the true beginning of what would become his opaque financial empire. He founded Intercontinental Assets Group, Inc., a consulting firm that positioned him as an advisor to high-net-worth individuals, and later created entities like J. Epstein & Co., later Financial Trust Co., which catered to a select clientele of billionaires and powerful figures. The enigma of Epstein's rapid ascent lies at the heart of this origin story, a puzzle that the Epstein Files illuminate through cross-reference timelines, early correspondences, and financial ledgers without ever fully resolving it. Here was a college dropout from a working-class Brooklyn neighborhood, raised by a Parks Department employee and a school aide who within a few short years had navigated from a public high school to teaching the children of Manhattan's elite, then to a partnership at a major Wall Street institution, and finally to independence as a financier managing fortunes. Conventional pathways, advanced degrees from Ivy League schools, family connections in banking, or inherited capital were absent. Instead, his trajectory relied on a combination of raw intelligence, personal charm, strategic networking, and an uncanny ability to impress those in positions of influence. Accounts from the period suggest he cultivated an air of mystery and sophistication, transforming his modest roots into an asset that appealed to those seeking unconventional talent. Yet questions linger in the documents. What specific skills or insights allowed him to bypass traditional barriers? How did early interactions at Dalton and Bear Stearns evolve into enduring relationships with individuals who would later form the backbone of his influence? The files contain fragments, references to early client introductions, investment strategies that yielded outsized returns, and patterns of discretion in business dealings that hint at deeper mechanisms at play, mechanisms that would only expand as his empire grew. As these details unfold across the archived pages, emails, and logs now available, Epstein's early life emerges not as a simple rags-to-riches tale, but as a study in transformation. From the quiet streets of Seagate, where the sounds of the Coney Island boardwalk mingled with the everyday struggles of immigrant-descended families, to the polished trading floors of Bear Stearns, his path was one of calculated ambition. He honed an ability to bridge worlds. The intellectual rigor of mathematics applied to finance, the social acumen developed in elite classrooms translated into client rapport, and the resilience forged in modest circumstances channeled into relentless pursuit of opportunity. The Brooklyn prodigy, as he might be remembered in hindsight, did not merely ascend. He engineered a persona and a professional foundation that defied expectations, setting the stage for the vast network documented in exhaustive detail within the files. His story in these formative years reveals the foundations of an opaque empire, one built on intellect, connections, and an enduring aura of enigma that would define the decades to come, inviting scrutiny and reflection on the systems that allow such trajectories to unfold unchecked. The documents preserve these origins with precision, offering a window into how a young man from unremarkable beginnings crafted a life that would intersect with power at the highest levels, leaving behind a legacy of questions that continue to resonate through every unsealed page. In the sprawling archives of the Epstein Files, now laid bare through the comprehensive releases mandated by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a central narrative emerges with striking clarity: the deliberate and methodical forging of an empire of influence. These millions of pages, emails, flight logs, address books, and correspondences reveal how Jeffrey Epstein, once a figure of modest origins, transformed himself into a pivotal connector among the world's most powerful individuals. The documents do not merely list names. They chronicle a sophisticated strategy of cultivation, where access to luxury, intellectual discourse, and exclusive social circles served as the currency that drew billionaires, politicians, scientists, and royalty into his orbit. Through meticulously preserved records, digitized flight manifests spanning decades, scanned pages from his infamous Black Book containing over 1,700 contacts, and chains of emails exchanged across continents, we witness the architecture of a network built not on overt transactions alone, but on a seductive blend of opulence, discretion, and perceived mutual benefit. The foundation of this web was laid in the late 1980s, shortly after Epstein's departure from Bear Stearns. The files illuminate his pivotal relationship with Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands and Victoria's Secret, as the cornerstone. Court documents and financial ledgers preserved in the releases detail how Epstein and Wexner first connected around 1986 or 1987, when Epstein was establishing himself as an independent financier. Wexner, already a retail titan worth billions, entrusted Epstein with extraordinary authority. By the early 1990s, Epstein had been granted power of attorney over Wexner's affairs, managing vast portions of his fortune. Emails and internal memos in the files show Epstein handling investments, real estate transactions, and even personal matters with a level of control that extended far beyond typical advisory roles. In one notable instance documented in property records unsealed among the files, Wexner transferred ownership of his sprawling Manhattan townhouse, a 7-story, 51,000 square foot residence on East 71st Street, valued today at over $56 million, to an entity controlled by Epstein in 2011, years after their formal business ties were said to have ended. This arrangement, detailed in deeds and correspondence, positioned Epstein in the heart of New York's elite social scene, granting him a physical base from which to host gatherings and forge new alliances. The seductive element here was subtle yet potent. Epstein offered Wexner not just financial acumen but entry into a world of curated exclusivity, where business discussions mingled with high society events. The files reveal how this partnership opened doors to other billionaires, as Wexner's endorsement lent Epstein an aura of legitimacy and access that proved invaluable. Building outward from this core, Epstein expanded his influence into broader circles of wealth. The flight logs and address books, now fully accessible in the 2025 to 2026 DOJ dumps, map connections to figures like Leon Black, the co-founder of Apollo Global Management, Glenn Dubin, the hedge fund manager, and others in the financial elite. Emails preserved in the archives show Epstein arranging meetings, sharing investment ideas, and facilitating introductions that blended professional opportunity with personal indulgence. For instance, records indicate frequent communications with billionaires who sought Epstein's insights on markets, philanthropy, and global affairs. The lifestyle he curated played a crucial role in these bonds. His private Boeing 727, often referred to in manifests as the Lolita Express, became a symbol of unparalleled mobility and luxury. Detailed passenger lists in the files document flights where Epstein hosted executives, offering them seamless travel between New York, Palm Beach, and international destinations. These journeys were not mere transportation. They were environments of refined conversation, fine dining aboard the aircraft, and an atmosphere of discretion that encouraged openness. The seductive draw was the promise of unfiltered access conversations without the prying eyes of the public or media, in settings where power could be discussed candidly. Politicians formed another vital strand in this web, as evidenced by extensive documentation in the releases. Bill Clinton's name appears repeatedly across flight logs, with records showing him aboard Epstein's jet on multiple occasions, more than 24 flights, according to some compiled manifests, often in connection with Clinton Foundation initiatives. Emails and schedules in the files detail interactions where Epstein facilitated meetings and travel, positioning himself as a behind-the-scenes facilitator. Clinton, in his post-presidency years, engaged in discussions spanning global health, economics, and diplomacy, with Epstein's network providing logistical support that enhanced these efforts. The documents reveal a pattern. Epstein cultivated these ties by offering not only the jet, but also introductions to other influential figures, creating a cycle of reciprocity. Similarly, the files include references to Donald Trump, with whom Epstein shared social circles in the 1980s and 1990s in New York and Palm Beach. Phone book entries, party invitations, and occasional correspondences highlight early associations, though the records also note a cooling of relations later on. Other political names surface in the Black Book and emails: Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and various U.S. senators and governors, each linked through documented calls, meetings, or shared events. The seductive lifestyle amplified these connections. Private dinners at Epstein's properties, where policy ideas could be exchanged amid elegant surroundings, or flights where time zones blurred into opportunities for strategic alliances. The files preserve invitations and thank you notes that underscore how Epstein presented himself as a neutral broker, someone who could bridge divides and provide rarefied access. Royalty added an international dimension to the empire of influence, with Prince Andrew emerging as one of the most prominent figures in the archived materials. Flight logs and photographs in the releases document multiple trips, including visits to Epstein's properties where the Duke of York was hosted. Emails detail arrangements for travel and social engagements, often involving Epstein's circle. The documents reveal a relationship built on shared interests in business and philanthropy, but framed within the opulent settings that Epstein mastered: yacht outings, estate stays, and exclusive gatherings that offered royalty a respite from protocol. Prince Andrew's presence, as noted in witness statements and logs, exemplified how Epstein leveraged his network to draw in those accustomed to privilege, offering a space where formal barriers dissolved. Other royal and diplomatic contacts appear in the address books, from European nobility to Middle Eastern figures, each entry accompanied by notes on potential synergies in finance or influence. Scientists and academics represented yet another pillar, drawn in by Epstein's self-styled role as a patron of knowledge. The files contain correspondences with Nobel laureates, university presidents, and researchers from institutions like Harvard and MIT. Bill Gates, the Microsoft co-founder, features prominently in emails from the 2010s, where discussions centered on philanthropy, global health initiatives, and potential collaborations. Flight records and meeting schedules show Epstein facilitating introductions and travel for Gates and others in tech and science. Marvin Minsky, the pioneering artificial intelligence researcher, is referenced in logs and guest lists, as are figures like Lawrence Summers, the economist and former Harvard president. Epstein's strategy here was intellectual seduction. He hosted salons and dinners where cutting-edge ideas in physics, biology, and economics were debated, positioning himself as a connector between academia and capital. The releases include grant proposals and funding discussions preserved in his records, illustrating how he offered financial support to research while gaining intellectual cachet. This drew scientists into his web, not through overt displays of wealth alone, but through an environment where brilliant minds could convene without institutional constraints, often aboard the jet or at private residences that doubled as think tanks. The seductive lifestyle that underpinned this entire network was no accident. It was a meticulously designed attractor, as the Epstein files make abundantly clear. Properties served as stages for these interactions: the New York mansion with its grand rooms for intimate dinners, the Palm Beach estate for relaxed gatherings, the New Mexico ranch for expansive retreats, and the Caribbean island for ultimate seclusion. Videos and images in the archives capture glimpses of these settings: opulent interiors, pools, and docks, where guests arrived via the private fleet. The jet itself, with its custom interiors documented in maintenance logs, offered privacy and comfort that commercial travel could not match. Parties and events, referenced in calendars and guest lists, mixed high-level discourse with elements of glamour, attractive company, fine cuisine, and an air of exclusivity that made participants feel part of an inner sanctum. Emails reveal Epstein curating these experiences, ensuring that billionaires discussed deals, politicians explored alliances, scientists brainstormed innovations, and royalty enjoyed respite, all within a framework of discretion. The files preserve patterns, repeated invitations, follow-up notes expressing appreciation, and references to mutual friends that expanded the circle further. What the documents ultimately reveal is a web not of coincidence, but of intentional design. Epstein's Black Book, with its thousands of entries cross-referenced against flight data, shows a hub-and-spoke model where he sat at the center, facilitating connections that benefited all parties. Redactions in certain areas hint at sensitivities, yet the volume of material over 3.5 million pages paints a portrait of influence built on access, luxury, and perceived value. Billionaires gained novel investment avenues and social prestige. Politicians found discrete platforms for dialogue. Scientists secured funding and collaborators. Royalty enjoyed elevated networks. The lifestyle was the glue. A world of private jets soaring over oceans, estates where conversations flowed late into the night, and an aura of sophistication that masked the complexities beneath. As these records continue to be analyzed, they underscore how such a network could thrive, drawing the powerful into orbits that extended far beyond any single individual's reach. The Epstein Files stand as a detailed ledger of this forging process, inviting careful study into the mechanics of elite interconnection and the enduring questions of accountability that arise from it. Through every preserved email, every logged flight, and every noted contact, the empire of influence comes into focus not as abstract history, but as a tangible structure preserved for examination, reflection, and understanding of power's intricate dance. In the expansive landscape of the Epstein Files, where millions of pages, emails, flight logs, and investigative records now stand as an open ledger of interconnected lives and operations, one figure emerges as uniquely central to the entire architecture: Ghislaine Maxwell. The documents, released in their vast entirety under the Epstein Files Transparency Act of 2025, portray her not as a peripheral associate, but as the indispensable partner whose background, family legacy, and strategic alliance with Jeffrey Epstein formed the operational backbone of the network, documented across those archives. Her story, preserved in detailed correspondences, witness statements, financial trails, and chronological records spanning decades, reveals a woman shaped by extraordinary privilege and profound upheaval, who transitioned from the daughter of a media titan into the architect of recruitment and coordination within Epstein's world. Ghislaine Maxwell was born on the 25th of December, 1961, in Maisons Laffitte, France, the youngest of 9 children born to Robert Maxwell and his wife Betty. From the outset, her life was immersed in the opulent yet turbulent realm of her father's ambitions. Robert Maxwell, born Jan Ludwig Hoch in 1,923 inches, what was then Czechoslovakia, to a poor Jewish family, had reinvented himself dramatically. He survived the Holocaust, fought with the British Army during World War II, and emerged as a decorated soldier before building a global media empire that at its peak included the Daily Mirror newspaper group, Macmillan Publishing, and stakes in numerous other outlets across Europe and beyond. The files contain extensive background materials on Robert Maxwell, including investigative summaries that detail his rise from poverty to billionaire status, his flamboyant lifestyle aboard the yacht named Lady Ghislaine in honor of his youngest daughter, and the persistent allegations of financial impropriety that ultimately unraveled his empire. Records preserved in the releases reference his suspected ties to intelligence circles. Speculation that surfaces in declassified memos and media clippings compiled by investigators positioning him as a larger-than-life figure whose influence extended into politics, business, and possibly covert operations. He was a man of immense charisma and ruthlessness, known for his domineering presence within the family home, where Ghislaine, as the favored youngest child, received both lavish attention and intense pressure to excel. The Maxwell household, as described in family correspondences and later biographical accounts cross-referenced in the Epstein Files, was one of contrasts. Sprawling estates in England, private jets, and elite social circles juxtaposed against Robert's authoritarian parenting style. Ghislaine attended prestigious schools, including Marlborough College and then Oxford University, where she studied modern languages and immersed herself in the world of high society. Contemporaries from those years, referenced in interview summaries within the files, recall her as intelligent, socially adept, and deeply loyal to her father. She worked briefly in her father's companies, taking on roles that honed her skills in event planning, public relations, and networking talents that would later prove instrumental. Robert Maxwell's legacy loomed large over her life, not only as a source of wealth and status, but as a template for navigating power. His empire, built on aggressive acquisitions and political connections, collapsed dramatically in 1991 amid revelations of massive pension fund thefts, totaling hundreds of millions of pounds from his employees' savings. The files include detailed financial audits and court documents from the post-death investigations that trace how Robert Maxwell's death on November 5, 1991, his body found floating in the Atlantic near the Canary Islands, after falling from the Lady Ghislaine, triggered the rapid disintegration of the family fortune. Speculation about the circumstances of his passing, whether accident, suicide, or something more orchestrated, fills pages of compiled reports, echoing the same questions that would later surround other figures in these archives. In the immediate aftermath of her father's death, Ghislaine Maxwell faced a stark reversal of fortune. The family's assets were seized, debts mounted, and she, along with her siblings, grappled with the public disgrace and financial ruin. Yet within months, she relocated to New York City, a move documented in travel records and early residence filings now part of the Epstein Files. It was during this period of transition, in the early 1990s, specifically around 1991 or 1992, that she first encountered Jeffrey Epstein. The precise circumstances of their meeting remain a point of interest in the released materials, with some emails and witness statements suggesting possible prior connections through her father's business dealings. Robert Maxwell had been exploring opportunities in the United States, including dealings with New York media and finance, and certain investigative notes reference Epstein's own early financial activities as potentially overlapping with Maxwell family interests. One photograph preserved in the archives, dated shortly after Robert's memorial service, captures Ghislaine and Epstein in conversation at an event, their interaction already appearing familiar. By the mid-1990s, their relationship had deepened into a close, personal and professional partnership. Initially romantic, it evolved into something more enduring. Epstein often described her publicly as his closest confidant, while internal documents show her assuming a multifaceted role that blended companionship with operational management. What the Epstein files illuminate with unprecedented detail is how Ghislaine Maxwell became the indispensable partner in Epstein's enterprises. Flight logs, now fully digitized and searchable in the 2025-2026 releases, record her presence on the private jet, dubbed in manifests as traveling alongside Epstein on hundreds of occasions, facilitating movements between New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and the Caribbean. Emails exchanged between them, numbering in the thousands and included in the DOJ batches, reveal a pattern of coordination. Ghislaine handling logistics, scheduling, and personal arrangements with precision. One set of correspondences details her oversight of property maintenance and staffing, referring to the various estates as shared domains where she acted as the de facto hostess and manager. Financial records in the archives further underscore her centrality. She held directorship roles in certain Epstein-linked entities, managed bank accounts using his addresses, and participated in investment decisions that sustained the network's infrastructure. Most critically, the files and accompanying trial-related materials document her alleged central role in recruitment and operations. Survivor testimonies, transcribed in affidavits and grand jury summaries now public, consistently describe Ghislaine as the primary point of contact for introducing young women and girls into Epstein's circle. Methods detailed in these accounts involved approaching individuals in public settings, schools, spas, or social events under the guise of offering legitimate opportunities such as modeling work, education assistance, or massage training. Witnesses recount how she would build trust through conversation, promises of mentorship, and displays of wealth, only to transition into grooming that normalized sexualized interactions. In one particularly detailed set of statements from the 2021 proceedings, referenced extensively in the releases, a victim described being recruited at age 14 during a summer program that Epstein had funded. Maxwell allegedly facilitated the introduction and subsequent travel. Another account outlines instructions provided by Maxwell on performing massages that escalated into abuse, positioning her as both recruiter and participant. The files preserve email chains and scheduling notes that align with these timelines, showing coordinated travel and property visits where such activities occurred. Her operational involvement extended to the day-to-day functioning of the network. Property records and staff interviews in the Epstein Files indicate that Maxwell managed household staff at the New York mansion, Palm Beach residence, Zorro Ranch, and Little St. James, ensuring an environment conducive to the activities described. She curated guest lists for gatherings, maintained the black book of contacts that overlapped with Epstein's influence network, and handled communications that kept the system discreet and efficient. Videos and images indexed in the releases capture her presence in these settings, often alongside Epstein, underscoring the partnership's intimacy and functionality. Legal filings from the Virginia Giuffre case, unsealed progressively and expanded in the 2026 dumps, further detail allegations of her direct participation in abuse, with Maxwell denying wrongdoing, but the evidence presented, including flight manifests listing her with minors on multiple legs, forming a compelling chronological record. The depth of this alliance, as revealed in the Epstein Files, highlights how Maxwell's background equipped her for such a role. The networking skills honed in her father's empire, the resilience forged in the face of financial collapse, and the social acumen developed amid elite circles translated seamlessly into the operational demands of Epstein's world. She bridged gaps, facilitated introductions, and maintained the aura of legitimacy that allowed the network to expand. Emails in the archives show her negotiating with vendors, arranging flights, and even discussing gifts or payments tied to individuals who later became part of the documented activities. This partnership endured for over a decade, with Maxwell remaining a fixture even as Epstein faced legal scrutiny in earlier years. The files contain post-2008 communications, where she continued coordinating aspects of his life, demonstrating loyalty that outlasted public fallout. As these records continue to be examined, they underscore the profound implications of this dark alliance. Ghislaine Maxwell's trajectory from the privileged daughter of a controversial tycoon to the convicted co-conspirator serving a 20-year sentence following her 2021 trial mirrors the broader themes of power, secrecy, and accountability woven throughout the Epstein files. Her father's legacy of empire building amid controversy provided a blueprint. Her partnership with Epstein operationalized it in ways that the documents now lay bare. Through every preserved email, every logged flight, and every witness account, the files present a detailed portrait of collaboration that was both personal and profoundly consequential. This alliance did not exist in isolation. It was the engine that sustained the properties, the travel, and the recruitment patterns detailed in subsequent sections of the archive. The Epstein Files, in their comprehensive release, ensure that this chapter of the story remains fully accessible, inviting ongoing analysis into how individual backgrounds and strategic partnerships can shape networks of influence and exploitation on such a scale. The materials stand as a testament to the importance of transparency, preserving the facts of Maxwell's indispensable role for scrutiny, reflection, and a clearer understanding of the events that unfolded across decades. In the vast repository of the Epstein Files, where millions of pages, videos, and images now stand as an unfiltered chronicle of events long concealed, the most profound and heart-wrenching revelations center on the lives of the young women and girls who were drawn into the trafficking network. These documents, affidavits, depositions, police reports, and survivor statements preserved across decades form the undeniable human core of the entire archive. They do not merely catalog crimes. They preserve the voices of those who endured systematic grooming, exploitation, and abuse, offering a window into the patterns that define the operation and the enduring human cost that followed. Through these records, we encounter not abstract statistics, but the personal accounts of courage amid profound betrayal, accounts that reveal how vulnerability was identified, trust was cultivated, and lives were indelibly altered within a meticulously structured network of control. The grooming methods, as detailed extensively in the unsealed files, were sophisticated and predatory, designed to exploit the hopes and insecurities of teenagers, often from modest or unstable backgrounds. Recruitment frequently began with seemingly innocuous opportunities. Ghislaine Maxwell, or associates acting on behalf of the network, would approach girls at malls, beaches, or even prestigious locations like the Mar-a-Lago resort in Palm Beach. Promises of modeling careers, financial assistance for education, or entry-level jobs in massage therapy were extended as lures. In one documented pattern from victim statements, a girl might be told she could earn hundreds of dollars for a simple massage session, with assurances that no sexual activity was involved. Lee's initial encounters were calibrated to build rapport, compliments on appearance, displays of wealth and sophistication, and offers of mentorship created a sense of special selection. The files contain transcripts where survivors describe how Maxwell would be warm and engaging, positioning herself as a maternal figure or glamorous guide into a world of opportunity. Once trust was established, the grooming escalated subtly requests to bring friends for similar opportunities, small payments that reinforced compliance, and gradual normalization of physical contact under the guise of massages. This pyramid-like structure, often described in investigative summaries within the documents as a molestation pyramid scheme, encouraged victims to recruit others, sometimes under implicit or explicit pressure to maintain favor or avoid repercussions. The patterns of abuse, meticulously logged in property records, flight manifests, and witness interviews now available in the releases, reveal a network that operated with chilling efficiency across multiple locations. At the Palm Beach mansion, for instance, police reports and victim depositions outline how young girls, many as young as 14, were summoned daily, sometimes multiple times a day. They would arrive expecting a legitimate massage job, only to find the sessions directed toward Epstein, often progressing to sexual acts. The files include detailed timelines showing girls being shuttled between properties via car services or the private jet, known in manifests as the Luta Express. On Little St. James Island, the seclusion amplified the control, remote settings made escape feel impossible, and the environment was engineered for isolation. Survivor accounts and documents describe being flown to the island under the pretense of work or vacation, then subjected to repeated exploitation involving Epstein and, in many cases, other individuals to whom they were trafficked. The New York mansion, the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, and even international destinations followed similar blueprints, opulent surroundings, masking a system where consent was illusory and power was absolute. Emails and internal logs preserved in the archive reference scheduling of massages with coded efficiency, cross-referencing names and times that align with victim testimonies of coercion. The trafficking extended beyond Epstein himself. The files document how girls were directed to perform acts for associates, with rewards or threats ensuring silence. This was not random predation, but an organized enterprise with recruiters, enablers, and logistical support forming a web that spanned years and continents. Among the most compelling elements in the Epstein files are the survivor testimonies themselves, raw, detailed, and preserved in depositions, affidavits, and trial transcripts that now fill thousands of pages. Virginia Giuffre's account, for example, stands as one of the most extensively documented. Recruited at age 17 while working at Mar-a-Lago, she described in sworn statements how Maxwell approached her with an offer to meet a wealthy financier who could help with her aspirations. What followed, according to her testimony, was a rapid immersion into the network, training in massage techniques that quickly turned sexual, followed by trafficking to high-profile figures at Epstein's properties. Giuffre's depositions detail specific incidents, locations, and the psychological manipulation that kept her entangled, emphasizing the sense of entrapment and the promises of a better future that dissolved into repeated abuse. Her courage in coming forward, even as a young woman navigating public scrutiny, is reflected in the files through her persistence and civil actions that helped crack open further disclosures. Annie Farmer's testimony, corroborated in court records and now part of the broader archive, highlights another dimension of the grooming. As a teenager interested in art and psychology, she was invited to the Zorro Ranch with assurances of intellectual discussions and career guidance. Instead, the visit involved unwanted advances and boundary violations that left lasting scars. Farmer's statements in the documents articulate the confusion of being made to feel complicit or ungrateful for rejecting the opportunities presented, a common theme in many accounts. Joanna Schoberg, another survivor whose deposition appears prominently, recounted being recruited while in college and subjected to similar patterns at the Palm Beach estate. Her descriptions of group settings and the normalization of inappropriate touching underscore how the network desensitized participants over time. Maria Farmer, one of the earliest to report concerns to authorities in the 1990s, provided early warnings documented in the files about the scale of the operation, describing her own experiences of surveillance and threats after speaking out. These testimonies, alongside dozens of others from unnamed victims in the initial Palm Beach investigations, paint a consistent picture. Young women lured by economic vulnerability or dreams of advancement, then trapped in a cycle where refusal carried implied consequences. The human cost detailed across these pages is immeasurable and multifaceted. Survivors speak in the documents of profound psychological trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and a shattered sense of self-worth that persisted long after the physical abuse ended. Many describe disrupted education and career paths, strained family relationships, and difficulties forming healthy, intimate bonds. The files include references to long-term therapy needs, substance issues stemming from coping mechanisms, and a pervasive distrust of authority figures after institutions failed to protect them initially. Economically, the exploitation left some in cycles of instability, while the public nature of later revelations brought additional layers of stigma and harassment. Yet woven through these accounts is an extraordinary thread of resilience. Victims who testified in Maxwell's 2021 trial, for instance, faced cross-examination and media attention but did so to ensure accountability. Their statements emphasize not victimhood alone, but the determination to prevent others from suffering similarly. The releases of 2020's Sex have allowed many to see their words finally validated in official records, providing a form of closure even as new details emerge. broader patterns in the trafficking network, as illuminated by the files, reveal how the operation relied on complicity and silence. Recruiters were often former victims themselves, coerced into expanding the pool to alleviate pressure on their own situations, a dynamic explicitly referenced in investigative summaries. Properties served as hubs where staff turned a blind eye or facilitated logistics, with flight logs showing repeated transports of young women alongside powerful passengers. The documents preserve instances where victims were flown internationally, further entrenching dependency through passports held or promises of exotic experiences. The emotional manipulation was constant. Affirmations of beauty and importance alternated with subtle reminders of dependency, creating a psychological hold that many survivors describe as more binding than physical restraint. In reflecting on these elements within the Epstein files, one cannot overlook the societal implications. The testimonies highlight systemic failures, law enforcement delays, plea deals that granted immunity to potential co-conspirators, and a culture where wealth insulated predators. Yet they also underscore the power of collective voices. Groups of survivors have advocated tirelessly, pushing for transparency that culminated in the massive document releases. Their efforts have influenced legislation, heightened awareness of trafficking indicators, and supported reforms in victim services. The human cost extends beyond individuals to families shattered by the knowledge of what their daughters endured, communities grappling with the proximity of such abuse, and a public force to confront how privilege can obscure exploitation. The archive does not sensationalize these stories. It preserves them with the gravity they demand, redacted where necessary for privacy, yet expansive in revealing the mechanics and the pain. Survivor after survivor recounts the initial hope that turned to dread, the grooming that eroded boundaries, and the abuse that fragmented identities. But in the same pages we find assertions of agency, women who rebuilt lives, pursued education despite setbacks, and channeled pain into advocacy. One testimony might describe the terror of isolation on the island. Another, the quiet strength in reporting to authorities years later. Collectively, they humanized the statistics, transforming the files from a ledger of crimes into a testament to endurance. As these records continue to be examined, the trafficking network emerges not as the work of one individual, but as a collaborative enterprise enabled by access, resources, and indifference. The patterns targeted recruitment of minors, normalization through luxury, escalation from massage to sexual demands, and trafficking to associates repeat across hundreds of statements. The human cost lingers in every account: lost innocence, fractured trust, and the lifelong work of healing. Yet the courage on display is equally persistent. Survivors who shared their stories in depositions, trials, and public forums did so knowing the personal toll, driven by a belief that exposure could dismantle similar networks elsewhere. Their words, now etched into the public domain through the Epstein files, serve as both memorial and warning, illuminating the depths of harm while celebrating the resilience that rises in response. In these documents, the voices of the broken yet unbroken stand as the most vital revelation, demanding that we listen, remember, and act to safeguard the vulnerable from such calculated predation. The files ensure their experiences are no longer whispers, but a resounding call for justice, accountability, and compassion in the face of systemic failure. In the extensive archives of the Epstein files, where millions of pages of investigative records, victim statements, police reports, and supporting evidence have been made public through the 2025 to 2026 releases under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a pivotal chapter unfolds with unmistakable clarity: the 2005 Palm Beach investigation. This was the moment when law enforcement first pierced the veil of secrecy surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's activities in Florida, triggered by the courageous report of a single 14-year-old girl and her family. What began as one complaint rapidly expanded into a comprehensive probe that uncovered a pattern of exploitation involving dozens of underage girls, many of them high school students from the local community. The documents now available preserve every detailed transcribed interviews, chronological logs, physical evidence inventories, and internal police memos, offering an unfiltered view of how the investigation developed, The evidence painstakingly assembled and the systemic challenges that arose even at this early stage. The investigation officially commenced on March 15, 2005, when a concerned parent contacted the Palm Beach Police Department. Her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been taken to Epstein's opulent waterfront mansion at 358 El Brillo Way by an older girl from a high school. According to the initial report, preserved in full within the files, the teenager was paid $300 in cash after being instructed to strip to her underwear and provide a massage to Epstein. What started as an apparent legitimate errand quickly escalated into unwanted sexual contact. The girl described how Epstein, alone in his bedroom, directed her movements and engaged in acts that left her distressed and confused. Her parents, alarmed by her account and the circumstances, immediately brought the matter to authorities rather than remaining silent. This single act of parental vigilance set in motion a 13-month inquiry that would expose far more than any one incident. Police reports note that the family's decision to come forward was driven by a desire to protect other potential victims, a theme echoed repeatedly in the survivor statements now digitized and accessible in the releases. Detective Joe Riccari, a seasoned investigator with the Palm Beach Police Department, was assigned as the lead detective. His meticulous approach, documented across hundreds of pages in the files, transformed the case from an isolated allegation into a wide-ranging inquiry. Riccari and his team began by corroborating the victim's account through basic verification steps. They reviewed phone records and conducted initial surveillance of the El Brillo Way property, noting a steady stream of young females arriving and departing, often in the afternoons and evenings. To build a stronger foundation, officers initiated trash pulls, legal searches of Epstein's discarded garbage outside the residence. In April 2005, these efforts yielded immediate results. Handwritten telephone message slips bearing the names and phone numbers of several girls, along with notations of appointment times that precisely matched the 14-year-old's description of her visit. One slip even referenced her by name alongside a timestamp that aligned with her statement. Additional items recovered included receipts for gifts and transportation provided to the girls, as well as mail addressed to associates involved in Epstein's household operations. These seemingly mundane discoveries, catalogued in detail in the police evidence logs now part of the Epstein Files, proved crucial in establishing a pattern rather than isolated events. As the probe intensified through the spring and summer of 2005, Riccari's team expanded their efforts by interviewing additional potential victims. Word of the investigation spread quietly within local high schools and social circles, prompting more girls to come forward. By the end of the year, investigators had spoken with approximately 30 to 36 young women, the vast majority of whom were underage at the time of their encounters with Epstein. Their accounts, transcribed verbatim and sworn statements, and preserved in the released documents, reveal the strikingly consistent modus operandi. Girls were typically recruited by other young women, often slightly older acquaintances, who approached them with promises of easy money for a simple massage. Many were told they would earn $200 to $300 per visit, an appealing sum for teenagers from modest backgrounds. Upon arrival at the mansion, they were escorted upstairs to Epstein's private quarters, where the encounter followed a predictable script: instructions to undress partially or fully, application of oil, and then escalating sexual demands. Epstein would often masturbate during the massage or direct the girls to perform specific acts while he touched them. Several victims described feeling pressured or manipulated, with Epstein making comments that normalized the behavior or offered incentives for bringing friends. The files contain poignant excerpts from these interviews, handled with care by the detectives to ensure the young women felt heard. One 16-year-old recounted being recruited by a classmate and visiting the house multiple times, each session involving similar acts and payments. Another, who had been 15 at the time, detailed how an assistant in Epstein's household called her phone just as she was being questioned by police, an incident captured in real-time logs that suggested active monitoring or interference. House staff interviews provided further corroboration. Juan Alessi, a longtime butler who had worked for Epstein for over a decade until 2002, described in a detailed November 2005 statement how young girls visited the residence frequently. sometimes 2 or 3 per day. He noted that the visitors appeared increasingly younger over time and that Epstein received massages daily. Alfredo Rodriguez, another household employee, echoed these observations, stating that the girls were not professional masseuses and that the encounters seemed far more than therapeutic. The sworn testimonies included in the Epstein files, alongside phone records and visitor logs, painted a picture of a household structured around these visits. Evidence collection extended beyond interviews and trash pulls. Detectives obtained cell phone records that mapped calls between Epstein, his assistants, and the recruited girls. They documented financial transactions, including cash payments and small gifts that served as rewards. Surveillance photographs and notes from stakeouts confirmed the flow of traffic to and from the mansion. In one instance, investigators recovered a high school report card belonging to one of the victims from Epstein's bedroom during a related search, further linking him directly to the individuals involved. The patterns that emerged were methodical: recruitment through social networks of teenage girls, transportation arranged by Epstein's staff or associates, and a routine designed to exploit vulnerability. Many of the girls came from unstable home environments or sought financial independence, factors that the released victim impact statements describe as making them susceptible to the offers of quick cash and perceived glamour. Throughout 2005 and into early 2006, the investigation faced subtle but persistent obstacles. Epstein's legal team was already active, and reports in the files note instances where private investigators appeared to contact potential witnesses. One victim described receiving a warning shortly after reporting her experience, in which an individual claiming ties to Epstein offered payment in exchange for non-cooperation. Despite these pressures, the Palm Beach Police Department pressed forward under Chief Michael Reiter's oversight. By February 2006, the case file had grown substantially, encompassing hundreds of pages of documentation. In May 2006, Rickery and his colleagues formally recommended charging Epstein with multiple counts of unlawful sexual activity with minors. The state attorney's office, however, took an unusual procedural step by referring the matter to a grand jury rather than filing direct charges. The grand jury, convened in June and July 2006, heard limited testimony primarily from a single victim and returned an indictment on just one count of felony solicitation of prostitution, a far narrower outcome than the evidence appeared to support. This discrepancy between the breadth of the police findings and the grand jury's limited charge is preserved in the Epstein files through transcripts and memos. Detective Rickery later expressed frustration in internal communications, noting that the investigation had identified clear evidence of widespread exploitation yet encountered institutional hesitation. Dissatisfied with the state-level resolution, the Palm Beach Police Department referred the case to the FBI in mid-2006, initiating what would become a parallel federal inquiry codenamed Operation Leap Year. The local probe's documentation, victim statements, evidence inventories, staff interviews, and chronological summaries formed the foundational backbone for subsequent federal efforts and is now fully accessible in the massive DOJ releases. The human cost detailed in these records remains central to the story. The girls, many still in high school and navigating adolescence, described feelings of confusion, shame, and betrayal after the encounters. Some continued to be contacted by Epstein's circle even after the investigation began, as phone logs confirm. The files emphasize their courage in coming forward, often at personal risk, and the long-term effects described in later impact statements: disrupted education, emotional trauma, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. The investigation also highlighted the role of enablers within Epstein's household. Assistants such as Sarah Kellin and Haley Robson were referenced in multiple victim accounts as facilitators who scheduled visits and sometimes recruited participants. Ghislaine Maxwell's name surfaces in certain statements as someone involved in introducing or coordinating girls, adding another layer to the operational network that the Palm Beach probe first illuminated. What the Epstein files reveal through these 2005 records is not merely a local police matter but the initial unraveling of a larger enterprise. The evidence collected corroborated across independent victim testimonies, physical artifacts from trash pulls, staff observations, and communication logs established beyond doubt a systematic pattern of recruiting and exploiting underage girls under the guise of massages. This was the first formal reckoning, the moment when authorities documented in exhaustive detail how Epstein's Palm Beach residence functioned as a hub for these activities. The investigation's thoroughness, preserved page by page in the unsealed archives, stands in contrast to the limited legal outcomes that followed, raising questions about influence and accountability that would echo for years. As more batches of documents continue to emerge, the 2005 Palm Beach probe remains a cornerstone, offering raw, unvarnished insight into how one family's report sparked a chain of revelations that exposed the scale of the operation and the resilience of those who chose to speak out. These files ensure that the voices of the victims and the diligence of the investigators are no longer confined to internal memos but are now part of the public historical record, demanding continued attention to the mechanisms that allowed such activities to persist undetected for so long. In the expansive archives of the Epstein Files were over 3.5 million pages of investigative records, internal memoranda, court filings, and correspondence now lie open to examination following the 2026 releases under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. One particular set of documents stands as a stark testament to institutional compromise and the limits of accountability. These are the records surrounding the 2008 non-prosecution agreement, an arrangement that granted Jeffrey Epstein extraordinary leniency despite a mounting body of evidence compiled by federal investigators, preserved in meticulous detail across thousands of unsealed pages, including draft agreements, email chains between prosecutors, victim statements that were sidelined, and internal Department of Justice assessments. This deal has come to symbolize what many describe as a profound systemic failure, one in which the scales of justice tilted heavily in favor of influence and expediency over the rights of victims and the pursuit of broader justice. To understand the contours of this agreement, the files invite us to revisit the trajectory that led to its formation. By late 2007, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had assumed primary control of the case originally sparked by the Palm Beach Police Department 2 years earlier. The documents reveal a comprehensive federal probe that had identified more than 36 minor victims, gathered extensive witness interviews, and compiled forensic evidence pointing to a pattern of recruitment and exploitation spanning multiple locations. Flight logs, phone records, and property visitor lists cross-referenced in the files painted a picture of operations that extended well beyond any single individual. Yet, rather than proceeding to a full federal indictment on charges that could have carried life sentences such as sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy, the path diverged toward negotiation. The Epstein files contain the actual correspondence from this period, emails exchanged among assistant U.S. attorneys, senior officials in the Southern District of Florida, and defense counsel that illustrate a process marked by intense behind-the-scenes bargaining. At the center of these negotiations stood Alexander Acosta, then the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, appointed to the position in 2005 by President George W. Bush. Acosta oversaw a team of federal prosecutors tasked with evaluating the strength of the case. The released memoranda and meeting notes preserved in the files show Acosta personally involved in key discussions, weighing the prospect of a trial against the possibility of a resolution that would avoid the uncertainties of litigation. Defense attorneys, including high-profile figures like Roy Black and Kenneth Starr, argued vigorously for concessions, citing Epstein's willingness to accept some level of responsibility while emphasizing the potential reputational harm to other unnamed parties. What emerges from the documents is a narrative of compromise. Federal charges that had been prepared were set aside in favor of a state-level plea in Palm Beach County, effectively shielding Epstein from the full weight of federal scrutiny. The non-prosecution agreement itself, signed on June 30, 2008, and now fully digitized and accessible within the Epstein files, is a document of remarkable breadth and leniency. Epstein agreed to plead guilty in state court to 2 felony charges, 1 count of procuring a person under 18 for prostitution and 1 count of solicitation of prostitution. These were comparatively minor offenses drawn from a much larger array of potential violations. In exchange, the agreement stipulated that the U.S. Attorney's Office would decline to prosecute Epstein or any potential co-conspirators on federal charges related to the conduct under investigation. This immunity clause was sweeping. It explicitly covered any potential co-conspirators, a phrase left deliberately broad in the text and interpreted in subsequent legal analyses preserved in the files as extending protection to individuals who had participated in or facilitated the activities. The documents reveal that this language was not incidental but negotiated with precision, effectively granting a shield not only to Epstein but to others whose roles were documented in the investigative materials, roles that the files later corroborate through victim affidavits and logistical records. The sentence imposed following the plea hearing on June 30, 2008, further underscored the deal's accommodating nature. Epstein received an 18-month term, which he ultimately served 13 months after accounting for good behavior credits. Yet the conditions attached to this incarceration were unprecedented in their flexibility. The files include the precise terms of the work release program approved by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. Epstein was permitted to leave the county jail 6 days per week for up to 12 hours each day, ostensibly to perform labor at the office of a non-profit organization he had established. In practice, as visitor logs and internal jail memoranda, now available in the releases, demonstrate, these hours allowed him to maintain significant aspects of his professional and personal life. He returned to his Palm Beach mansion on weekends, hosted visitors, and continued to conduct business, all while technically fulfilling the sentence. The agreement also mandated that Epstein register as a sex offender, but the files show that enforcement of broader monitoring requirements was minimal during this period, with Epstein's legal team successfully navigating the registration process in a manner that limited public visibility. Equally significant and perhaps most troubling in the eyes of the documents is the manner in which victims were excluded from the process. The Epstein files contain dozens of affidavits and letters from victims who describe learning of the plea deal only after it had been finalized. This exclusion directly contravened provisions of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, a point later affirmed in federal court rulings referenced in the releases. Internal emails among prosecutors, now unsealed, reveal discussions about whether to notify victims in advance. The consensus, as recorded, prioritized the confidentiality of the negotiations. One preserved memo notes that informing the victims could complicate the resolution, a rationale that stands in stark contrast to the stated goals of victim-centered justice. The files preserved the raw impact of this decision through victim impact statements submitted after the fact statements that detail feelings of betrayal, powerlessness, and renewed trauma when the extent of the leniency became public. Alexander Acosta's role receives particular scrutiny across the archived materials. In a 2011 letter and subsequent interviews referenced in the documents, Acosta articulated his reasoning. He believed the evidence, while substantial, might not guarantee convictions on the most serious charges, and the non-prosecution agreement ensured at least some accountability while protecting unnamed co-conspirators from further exposure. Yet the files also include critical assessments from within the Department of Justice and external reviews that question the depth of that analysis. Redacted portions of prosecutorial memos hint at external pressures, though the precise nature of those influences remains subject to ongoing interpretation, while unredacted sections detail the extraordinary concessions granted. Acosta himself later resigned from his position as Secretary of Labor in 2019 amid renewed public focus on the deal, an event chronicled in contemporaneous news clippings and official statements preserved alongside the original legal papers. The immediate aftermath of the agreement, as chronicled in the Epstein Files, reveals how the deal permitted Epstein's activities to persist with diminished interruption. Jail records show him maintaining contact with associates, managing financial affairs, and even traveling under certain conditions during the work release phase. The immunity provision, by shielding potential co-conspirators, effectively closed off avenues for further federal investigation at that time, allowing networks of recruitment and facilitation to operate in the shadows for years afterward. Financial ledgers and correspondence from the period, now part of the public archive, demonstrate that Epstein's opaque empire continued to function, with business relationships intact and properties maintained. This continuity is one of the most sobering revelations in the documents. A legal resolution intended to resolve the matter instead functioned, in the assessment of later analyses included in the files, as a de facto license for the status quo. Critics of the deal, whose perspectives are echoed in legal briefs and congressional inquiries preserved in the releases, point to broader implications for the justice system. The non-prosecution agreement exemplified how wealth, legal firepower, and institutional caution could converge to produce outcomes that appeared disconnected from the scale of alleged harm. The files contain comparative analyses with other high-profile cases, highlighting disparities in charging decisions and sentencing leniency. They also document the long-term toll on victims, whose civil suits in subsequent years repeatedly referenced the 2008 agreement as having compounded their suffering by signaling official indifference. In one particularly detailed victim deposition from later proceedings, now included in the archive, the speaker describes the plea as the moment when the system chose silence over truth, a sentiment that resonates through multiple accounts. As these records continue to be examined, the 2008 non-prosecution agreement emerges not as an isolated misstep, but as a case study in systemic vulnerability. The Epstein files preserve every clause, every signature, every internal justification, allowing for a granular reconstruction of decisions made in closed rooms. They reveal the human cost through unfiltered victim voices, the procedural shortcuts through prosecutorial notes, and the enduring questions of accountability through the very existence of the transparency mandate that brought them to light. The deal's legacy is one of unresolved tension, a moment when federal authority chose containment over confrontation, granting immunity that extended far beyond the individual at its center and leaving patterns of exploitation to persist unchecked for another decade. In the calm light of these documents, the Sweetheart deal stands as a mirror to the institutions that forged it, reflecting both the pressures of high-stakes litigation and the imperative for vigilance in ensuring that justice remains impartial, thorough, and above all equitable for those most harmed. The pages of the Epstein files do not merely recount events, they compel reflection on the mechanisms that allowed such an agreement to take shape. Every email chain, every draft revision, every overlooked victim notification serves as a reminder that transparency, once achieved, illuminates not only past failures but the ongoing responsibility to confront them. This chapter in the historical record, now fully accessible, underscores the delicate balance between resolution and reckoning, between legal pragmatism and moral clarity. It is a record that demands careful study, for within its lines lies a cautionary tale about the cost of compromise when the stakes involve the lives and dignity of the vulnerable. Through the lens of these preserved materials, the 2008 non-prosecution agreement remains a pivotal, sobering illustration of how influence can shape outcomes, and how the pursuit of truth requires unrelenting scrutiny even decades later. In the meticulously compiled pages of the Epstein Files, released through the sweeping mandates of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a dramatic chapter unfolds that captures the resurgence of accountability after years of relative silence. This is the story of how a powerful journalistic investigation pierced the veil of protection that had shielded Jeffrey Epstein since his controversial 2008 plea agreement, igniting a federal probe that culminated in his high-profile arrest and the filing of serious sex trafficking charges in the Southern District of New York. The documents, now available, spanning internal FBI memoranda, investigative timelines, victim affidavits, flight manifests, and prosecutorial filings, preserve every detail of this modern reckoning, offering an unfiltered view into the mechanisms that finally brought long-standing allegations back into the courtroom spotlight. The catalyst arrived on November 28, 2018, when the Miami Herald published a groundbreaking three-part investigative series titled Perversion of Justice: Authored by reporter Julie K. Brown, the series drew upon more than 80 interviews with survivors, court records, and previously overlooked evidence to expose the full scope of Epstein's activities and the extraordinary leniency granted to him more than a decade earlier. The articles meticulously detailed how Epstein had assembled a network that recruited underage girls under the guise of massage sessions, only for those encounters to escalate into sexual abuse, with many victims then encouraged to recruit others in a pyramid-like structure. Brown's reporting highlighted the 2005 Palm Beach police investigation that had identified dozens of potential victims, yet resulted in a non-prosecution agreement that immunized Epstein and unnamed co-conspirators from federal charges. Emails and internal correspondence preserved in the Epstein files show how the series quickly reverberated through law enforcement channels. Within days of publication, the articles were shared widely among federal prosecutors and agents, prompting immediate discussions about reopening avenues of inquiry that had been dormant. The impact of the Miami Herald series was profound and immediate. Public outrage surged as readers confronted the human cost documented through survivor testimonies, accounts of grooming, exploitation, and lifelong trauma that had been minimized or sidelined in earlier proceedings. The files contain clippings, social media analytics, and internal notes reflecting a spike in tips to the FBI and Department of Justice hotlines. Congressional offices received constituent demands for oversight, and media outlets across the country amplified the story, citing the Herald's work as a turning point. Within the archived records, one can trace how this journalistic effort directly influenced prosecutorial strategy. By early 2019, the Southern District of New York had assumed primary responsibility, building upon leads that originated in Florida but extended to New York operations. FBI agents, guided by the detailed victim narratives published in the series, began re-interviewing survivors whose statements now form substantial portions of the unsealed documents, flight logs, address books, and property records, many of which appear in their original scanned forms in the 2025-2026 releases, were cross-referenced to corroborate patterns of travel and recruitment spanning multiple states. As the investigation intensified through the spring of 2019, the Epstein files preserve a timeline of escalating activity. Agents executed search warrants on Epstein's Manhattan mansion in early 2019, recovering evidence that included photographs, financial records, and electronic devices containing contacts linked to the network. Victim statements collected during this period, now digitized and publicly accessible, describe continued recruitment efforts even after the 2008 plea deal, with some accounts alleging that the scheme persisted into the 2010s. The documents reveal a coordinated effort between the FBI's New York field office and the SDNY, where prosecutors assembled a case focused on conspiracy to commit sex trafficking and actual sex trafficking of minors. The indictment, when unsealed, would cite specific instances between 2002 and 2005. But the investigative files demonstrate that the probe examined a broader time frame, using the Herald's reporting as a roadmap to connect dots that had been disconnected for over a decade. The climax of this renewed scrutiny came on Saturday, July 6, 2019. Epstein's private jet, the Boeing 727, long documented in the flight manifests now available in the files, touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey shortly after 5 p.m. following a transatlantic flight from Paris. Waiting on the tarmac were members of the FBI and the New York Police Department. Epstein was taken into custody without incident as he disembarked. The arrest warrant, detailed in the released prosecutorial records, cited probable cause based on the sex trafficking conspiracy. News of the detention spread rapidly, with the files including contemporaneous media alerts and internal DOJ notifications that captured the moment. Epstein was transported to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he was held pending arraignment. The following Monday, July 8, the indictment was unsealed in federal court, formally charging him with 1 count of sex trafficking of minors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The 14-page charging document, preserved in full within the Epstein files, painted a vivid picture of the alleged scheme. It described how Epstein and his associates recruited dozens of underage girls, some as young as 14 from New York and Florida, luring them with promises of money for massages that inevitably led to sexual abuse. Payments were made to the victims, who were then encouraged to bring in additional girls, creating a self-sustaining operation that spanned years and multiple properties. The indictment highlighted specific details corroborated by evidence gathered during the renewed probe. It noted that Epstein maintained a vast network of recruiters and that he paid victims to recruit others, ensuring a steady supply of minors for exploitation. Prosecutors alleged that this conduct continued even after his 2008 conviction, with the conspiracy charge encompassing efforts to conceal the activity through payments, non-disclosure agreements, and the strategic use of his private aircraft and residences. Court transcripts and detention hearing records in the files show that during the initial appearance before Magistrate Judge Deborah Freeman, prosecutors argued forcefully against bail, citing the flight risk posed by Epstein's wealth, international connections, and history of evading full accountability. The judge agreed, ordering him held without bail. The files contain detailed inventories of items seized during the arrest and subsequent searches: cell phones, hard drives, and safe contents that further supported the charges and would later contribute to the broader evidentiary base released under the Transparency Act. This 2019 arrest and indictment represented far more than a single legal action. They marked the beginning of a systematic dismantling of the protections that had allowed Epstein's activities to persist. The Epstein Files document how the Miami Herald's reporting served as the spark that reignited federal interest, leading investigators to revisit old case files, recontact witnesses, and analyze patterns across jurisdictions. Emails exchanged among prosecutors in the months leading up to the arrest reveal a determination to avoid the perceived mistakes of 2008, with explicit references to ensuring victim voices were centered. The charges focused on the interstate and international nature of the trafficking operation, invoking the Mann Act and other statutes to underscore the severity. Public reaction, captured in archived news summaries and public statements within the documents, underscored a collective demand for justice. Victims who had spoken to the Herald came forward anew, their updated statements forming key exhibits in the case file. As Epstein was processed into the federal system, the files preserved the procedural steps that followed: the assignment of a trial date, the filing of additional motions, and the gathering of supplementary evidence that would ultimately feed into subsequent proceedings. The arrest generated a wave of renewed media scrutiny, with outlets revisiting the 2005 Palm Beach case, the Sweetheart deal, and the web of influence that had shielded him. Within the released archives, one finds side-by-side comparisons of 2008 plea documents and the 2019 indictment, illustrating how the new charges directly addressed gaps left by the earlier non-prosecution agreement. The FBI's investigation, as detailed in progress reports now public, involved forensic analysis of electronic evidence, financial tracing of payments to recruiters and victims, and coordination with international authorities regarding Epstein's overseas travel documented in the flight logs. The significance of this moment in the Epstein files cannot be overstated. It transformed scattered allegations into concrete federal charges backed by a mountain of corroborating material. The 2019 case set the stage for the deeper revelations that would emerge in later court proceedings and, ultimately, in the massive document dumps of 2025 and 2026. Every element: the Herald's exhaustive reporting, the FBI's methodical reinvestigation, the dramatic airport arrest, and the precise language of the sex trafficking indictment, demonstrates how sustained public pressure and journalistic persistence can compel institutions to act. The files now allow us to follow the thread from the November 2018 articles through to the July 2019 courtroom, witnessing how a decade of apparent impunity gave way to a reckoning grounded in evidence, survivor testimony, and legal determination. These records stand as a testament to the power of transparency, preserving not only the charges themselves but the investigative backbone that supported them, ensuring that the events of 2019 remain an indelible part of the historical ledger, available for ongoing study and reflection. Through page after page of memos, logs, and filings, the storm's return is laid bare, reminding us of the persistent pursuit of justice in the face of entrenched power. In the extensive archives now available through the Epstein Files Transparency Act, one of the most scrutinized and enigmatic sections pertains to the final hours of Jeffrey Epstein in federal custody. These documents, spanning internal Bureau of Prisons records, FBI investigative summaries, medical examiner reports, and the detailed findings of the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General, provide a comprehensive yet profoundly unsettling account of events that unfolded at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan on the night of August 9 into the early morning of August 10, 2019. The files do not resolve every question, but they lay bare a sequence of systemic lapses, procedural failures, and overlooked protocols that culminated in Epstein's death while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. What emerges from these pages is not a simple narrative of suicide or foul play, but a meticulously documented portrait of institutional shortcomings that allowed a high-profile detainee to remain unmonitored for hours in circumstances that invited intense public scrutiny and speculation. Epstein had been in custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center since his arrest on July 6, 2019, following the unsealing of a federal indictment in the Southern District of New York. The facility, an aging federal jail in Lower Manhattan known for its overcrowded conditions and history of operational challenges, housed him initially in the Special Housing Unit, or SHU, a segregated area designed for inmates requiring heightened security or protection. Records preserved in the files indicate that Epstein was placed there due to his notoriety and the nature of the charges against him. On July 23, 2019, just over 2 weeks into his detention, an earlier incident occurred that is detailed extensively in incident reports and psychological evaluations now part of the release materials. Epstein was found in his cell with marks on his neck, prompting staff to respond and temporarily place him on suicide watch. Medical and mental health assessments followed, leading to his removal from that heightened status after several days. The files include notes from psychology department staff directing that he be assigned a cellmate for ongoing monitoring, a directive that was not ultimately followed on the night in question. By August 9, Epstein occupied a cell alone on the lower tier of the SHU. The Epstein files contain floor plans, log entries, and staff rosters that map the layout precisely. A compact tier with 8 cells, accessible only through locked doors, with surveillance cameras positioned to cover common areas and entry points. Yet, as the OIG investigation report and accompanying FBI forensic analyses reveal, long-standing technical deficiencies plagued the facility's digital video recorder system. A malfunction identified as early as July 29, 2019 had rendered nearly all cameras in and around the SHU incapable of recording footage, even though live feeds were still available to monitoring stations. The files document internal emails and maintenance requests, showing that this issue was known to staff but remained unaddressed until after the events of that night. Only partial video from one functional camera survived, capturing movements in the broader SHU common area, but not the direct view of Epstein's cell door. The preserved segments, analyzed frame by frame in the investigative appendices, show no unauthorized entry into the tier between approximately 10:40 p.m. on August 9 and 6:30 a.m. the following morning, with some emails and witness statements suggesting possible prior connections through her father's business dealings. Robert Maxwell had been exploring opportunities in the United States, including dealings with New York media and finance, and certain investigative notes reference Epstein's own early financial activities as potentially overlapping with Maxwell family interests. One photograph preserved in the archives, dated shortly after Robert's memorial service, captures Ghislaine and Epstein in conversation at an event, their interaction already appearing familiar. By the mid-1990s, their relationship had deepened into a close, personal, and professional partnership. Initially romantic, it evolved into something more enduring. Epstein often described her publicly as his closest confidant, while internal documents show her assuming a multifaceted role that blended companionship with operational management. What the Epstein files illuminate with unprecedented detail is how Ghislaine Maxwell became the indispensable partner in Epstein's enterprises. Flight logs, now fully digitized and searchable in the 2025-2026 releases, record her presence on the private jet, dubbed in manifests as traveling alongside Epstein on hundreds of occasions, facilitating movements between New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and the Caribbean. Emails exchanged between them, numbering in the thousands and included in the DOJ batches, reveal a pattern of coordination. Ghislaine handling logistics, scheduling, and personal arrangements with precision. One set of correspondences details her oversight of property maintenance and staffing, referring to the various estates as shared domains where she acted as the de facto hostess and manager. Financial records in the archives further underscore her centrality. She held directorship roles in certain Epstein-linked entities, managed bank accounts using his addresses, and participated in investment decisions that sustained the network's infrastructure. Most critically, the files and accompanying trial-related materials document her alleged central role in recruitment and operations. Survivor testimonies, transcribed in affidavits and grand jury summaries now public, consistently describe Ghislaine as the primary point of contact for introducing young women and girls into Epstein's circle. Methods detailed in these accounts involved approaching individuals in public settings, schools, spas, or social events under the guise of offering legitimate opportunities such as modeling work, education assistance, or massage training. Witnesses recount how she would build trust through conversation, promises of mentorship, and displays of wealth, only to transition into grooming that normalized sexualized interactions. In one particularly detailed set of statements from the 2021 proceedings, referenced extensively in the releases, a victim described being recruited at age 14 during a summer program that Epstein had funded. Maxwell allegedly facilitated the introduction and subsequent travel. Another account outlines instructions provided by Maxwell on performing massages that escalated into abuse, positioning her as both recruiter and participant. The files preserve email chains and scheduling notes that align with these timelines, showing coordinated travel and property visits where such activities occurred. Her operational involvement extended to the day-to-day functioning of the network. Property records and staff interviews in the Epstein files indicate that Maxwell managed household staff at the New York mansion, Palm Beach residence, Zorro Ranch, and Little St. James, ensuring an environment conducive to the activities described. She curated guest lists for gatherings, maintained the black book of contacts that overlapped with Epstein's influence network, and handled communications that kept the system discreet and efficient. Videos and images indexed in the releases capture her presence in these settings, often alongside Epstein, underscoring the partnership's intimacy and functionality. Legal filings from the Virginia Giuffre case, unsealed progressively and expanded in the 2026 dumps, further detail allegations of her direct participation in abuse, with Maxwell denying wrongdoing, but the evidence presented including flight manifests listing her with minors on multiple legs, forming a compelling chronological record. The depth of this alliance, as revealed in the Epstein files, highlights how Maxwell's background equipped her for such a role. The networking skills honed in her father's empire, the resilience forged in the face of financial collapse, and the social acumen developed amid elite circles translated seamlessly into the operational demands of Epstein's world. She bridged gaps, facilitated introductions, and maintained the aura of legitimacy that allowed the network to expand. Emails in the archives show her negotiating with vendors, arranging flights, and even discussing gifts or payments tied to individuals who later became part of the documented activities. This partnership endured for over a decade, with Maxwell remaining a fixture even as Epstein faced legal scrutiny in earlier years. The files contain post-2008 communications, where she continued coordinating aspects of his life, demonstrating loyalty that outlasted public fallout. As these records continue to be examined, they underscore the profound implications of this dark alliance. Ghislaine Maxwell's trajectory from the privileged daughter of a controversial tycoon to the convicted co-conspirator serving a 20-year sentence following her 2021 trial mirrors the broader themes of power, secrecy, and accountability woven throughout the Epstein files. Her father's legacy of empire building amid controversy provided a blueprint. Her partnership with Epstein operationalized it in ways that the documents now lay bare. Through every preserved email, every logged flight, and every witness account, the files present a detailed portrait of collaboration that was both personal and profoundly consequential. This alliance did not exist in isolation. It was the engine that sustained the properties, the travel, and the recruitment patterns detailed in subsequent sections of the archive. The Epstein Files, in their comprehensive release, ensure that this chapter of the story remains fully accessible, inviting ongoing analysis into how individual backgrounds and strategic partnerships can shape networks of influence and exploitation on such a scale. The materials stand as a testament to the importance of transparency, preserving the facts of Maxwell's indispensable role for scrutiny, reflection, and a clearer understanding of the events that unfolded across decades.